As per the FSLRC, we imagined the board slightly differently from what is existing today. The board is the apex body of a mini-state which exercises or performs legislative functions, executive functions, and judicial functions. So in some sense, it's a mini-state, and the board of the agency is the apex body of the state. The FSLRC was very conscious of imposing a 360-degree view of accountability on the functioning of the board, which basically requires boards and agencies to explain their functioning, to allow for greater scrutiny of their functions, and to increase the possibility of independent review. And as a background to this, we looked at what kind of conditions and legislative mandates are imposed on boards worldwide, to basically try and see whether these kinds of requirements are feasible. One of the first things we saw was the Federal Administrative Procedure Act from the US. It's been in operation since the 1950s. And the interesting part about it is it does not apply to any specific sectoral regulator. It applies, this particular provision applies to any agency which has a board. So it could be the Food and Drug Administration, or it could be the Securities and Exchange Commission. And as you can see, the requirements are fairly stringent in terms of imposing transparency. Also in terms of what the board can do or cannot do. For example, no board member can conduct any agency business except as specified under this act. You need to give a prior public notice of a week before you have meetings. Interestingly, every portion of every meeting has to be open to the public. And after we end the presentation, I'll walk you through some examples to show you how they're complying with these requirements. There are specified exceptions to disclosure requirements. Boards have some flexibility in identifying what kind of information is confidential or sensitive and can be delayed or not released at all. However, you do need a specific vote of the majority of the board to redact or delay a particular piece of information. Interestingly, there is a specific power for courts to grant injunctive relief on these matters. Under the IFC, we have thankfully not gone this far, keeping in mind the fact that the Indian judiciary is different from the US judiciary. But we have tried to broadly incorporate some of these features. Similar powers and limits and mandates are also given under the UK FSMA Act. And I would encourage you to go through these in detail. So what the FSLRC recommended was that boards in India should incorporate global best practices of conducting these functions which are interested to the boards. So if you look at page 75 of the handbook, we have culled out the relevant portions which we think can be implemented without any legislative change, and we have put them in section 7.2 on page 75. I won't go into these in detail. You can peruse through them. It's about a half a page. And if there are any questions, we would be happy to get back to you on them. Broadly, the second schedule of the Indian Financial Code talks about the frequency of meetings, the quorum necessary for conducting a meeting, how you take and record decisions, how you vote on them. And it also requires that if a board member has a conflict of interest on a particular issue, he or she is expected to declare such a conflict. So in many ways, the IFC board is different from the existing boards because of these specific limits and mandates that have been given. So as per the handbook, the board has a very, very important function in regulation making, which Arjun and Kushagra covered in great detail yesterday. It is expected to have a stronger supervisory role over the staff, and there is a much more tighter, more detailed legal process which governs the way the board functions. And I've just talked about the role of the board in regulation making specifically as an example because that is really the heart and soul of what a regulatory agency does. So what does this require from the board and the staff? It requires detailed proposals, it requires board approvals, it requires the board can call for further information. The approvals which the board will, the decisions that the board will approve will have to be specific, and each decision will have to be voted on separately. And Kushagra and Arjun explained what documentation is required when the board makes regulations. What this implies is much more extensive and structured deliberation. It requires much more paperwork coming to the board from the staff. And you also require an approval of final regulations to be voted on. So there is a much higher requirement of legal process for all aspects of a board's work. You have to record all these deliberations because you have to publish minutes of all meetings. You have to vote on every decision separately. At the end of the meeting, we'll take you through some minutes where other regulators actually record votes on the separate points on the agenda that the board discussed. And this leads to a higher emphasis on transparency. In terms of implementation, this is something we wanted to discuss with you. We are thinking board secretariats, in whatever form and shape they are, will require some capacity augmentation because of the higher amount of process compliance and paperwork that is required. Specifically, there will have to be some form of a dedicated team within the secretariat which will look at whether regulation framing requirements are being complied with. And I won't go into these in detail, these have already been talked about. But very broadly, infrastructure requirements for boards will increase. Immediate publication of all minutes and related documents will have to be ensured. So there has to be greater coordination between the person manning the website and the person responsible for putting stuff out on the website. And board resolutions will be required for all of the above. And what I mean is that the board has to take a call and say, yes, we are going to do all of this, and pass a resolution and ask the staff to go ahead and implement all these changes. So this is very broadly what we see how we see the role of the board changing. I'll very quickly move on to transparency. The FSLRC philosophy was that there should be maximum transparency, and anything from a positive list approach, you move to a negative list approach. Instead of saying this should go on the website, you should have a detailed manual on what should not go on the website. So save some things that actually cannot be released. Everything else should be put up on the website as soon as possible. So this flows from the duty of the regulator to explain its actions to regulated entities, and any changes that you make on firms or entities that are governed by you, those firms and regulated entities should have the benefit of getting prior information from all of you. The rationale for this is you need greater transparency, which actually prevents abuse in many cases. Secondly, it builds credibility in what the regulator is doing. If you have everything up on the website, it's very hard to allege bias or prejudice, because the adherence to that process and the adherence to putting everything up on the website actually prevents people from saying we are not clear on how you have reached this decision. So we think this is of benefit to both regulated entities and to regulators. The FSTC agreed to implement the recommendations of the FSLRC on this regard. These are very specific points of action which can be done without legislative changes. One is all regulations and relevant information should be put up within 24 hours of their coming into force. And the important part is it should be text searchable. Now, the IFC is, I think, the first law in India which requires that all documents should be put up on the regulator's website in text searchable format. What does that mean? Sometimes somebody will put up a scan of a PDF. When you're trying to search for the document, because it's a scan, that does not show up on the search result. So anything that cannot be searched for is basically very difficult for a regulated entity to locate on your website. What we are saying is, what the FSLRC is recommending is everything should be text searchable. This increases user accessibility and therefore enhances transparency. In doing so, it also reduces the routine workload on the regulator. You would probably know this better, but you're probably also deluged with a lot of requests for clarity and information on what you're regulating and how you're regulating. The greater the information up on the website, the lesser the requests you get for this kind of clarity or clarification. Also, and this is just to repeat what I said earlier, the more information that is shared on the website, the less likely it is that your decisions or your regulations will be challenged either in the public domain or in courts or by other authorities. The last is just a coincidental benefit that it makes it easier for foreign regulators, for foreign entities to come and look at your website to figure out what the regulatory framework under your existing laws are, and therefore it promotes greater cooperation and dialogue with foreign regulators. So what does the handbook implementation on transparency require? The first component of that is the IFC talks about publication. It says everything has to be published. Under existing laws, the requirement is to publish in the official gazette, whereas here it's just publication. So the idea is that if it's not on the website, if it's not publicly available, it does not exist. So all regulatory instruments, all decision orders, all enforcement actions, as far as practicable. I mean, if it's something of a commercially sensitive nature, if it's going to hurt a particular regulated entity, you can have specific carve-outs to prevent or to not put those up on the website. But apart from those very specific limited circumstances, everything should be published on the website. And again, most regulators are already doing a lot of these things. We are just saying that what you're already doing can be made much more better, much more accessible, and implementing the handbook would get a uniform standard of transparency all across the regulated sector. What is the standard for publication of this information? The IFC says that publication means that you publish information which is in a manner best suited to bring that information to the attention of people who are affected by this information and to the public at large. So it's not just an obligation to communicate with the particular party who is being regulated, it's also to the public at large. And this could include electronic means. How we see this working is that your primary point of contact with regulated entities and consumers is going to be your website. Under existing laws, of course, you have requirements to send written communications, and that's fine. But the emphasis should be to communicate more and more through your website. And this has to be done as soon as may be practicable. So what this requires of all of you is to go and identify what kinds of information should be published or rather not published. How do you bring this information to the attention of the public and regulated entities in a better way than at present? And also thinking hard about how your websites should be designed. And at the end of the presentation, I'll take you through a couple of examples on this. Also, there has to be some standard limit within different kinds of information have to be published. For example, the IFC requires that board minutes should be published within 3 weeks of every meeting. But for a lot of other such documents and instruments, there's no specific requirement. So regulators have to go and think about what is a good time within which regulatory instruments and other documents have to be put up on the website. So what are you required to publish? Regulations, circulars, orders, guidelines, and again, a lot of you are already doing most of it. Regulatory actions, show cause notices, and final decisions. So in some cases, of course, these are commercially sensitive. These could hurt the interests of a particular regulated entity. And we would urge you to go and think about what are those circumstances, identify a carve-out or a specific exception in which you would not publish such information, but publish all the other information that can be put up on the website. So prepare a manual and adhere to it. And what it basically leads up to is to redesign your website so as to get to something which is globally recognized, which is as credible as most other regulators in first world countries. And again, I'll just take you through some of the examples to give you an illustration of what we mean by this. And lastly, we are going to talk about the role of transparency in the board. So FSLRC said that since the board is the apex agency, the requirement of transparency in board meetings is that much higher. So as far as possible, every single thing that the board does should be put up on the website. The idea behind this is boards have some autonomy, boards have specific mandates, boards have independence, but that has to be mediated through a system of public accountability. Because even if you have responsibilities to report to the parliament, even if you have responsibilities to report to the executive, this is a far greater continuous level of accountability on a daily basis. And in many cases, it aids decision making because you get better feedback from people who are being regulated by you. So FSLRC agreed to implement these recommendations. One, the secretary of the board will have to keep records of all votes, all resolutions, the agenda of every board meeting. These will have to be made public within 3 weeks of every meeting. And selected portions may not be published if such information is personal information about a particular regulated entity, or it discloses certain specific types of information. Again, if you look at the second schedule of the IFC, the types of information that can not be disclosed are, say, investigative techniques, or information that if released in the public domain would immediately cause some sort of financial instability. So there are specific carve-outs and exceptions for releasing personal information or certain types of information, and they're given in greater detail in the second schedule, which I would urge you to go back and read. So again, selected portions that can be delayed are information that would lead to instability, which would actually frustrate any action of the financial agency. If you're contemplating enforcement action and this information is released, the person who you're planning to go after might alter his behavior and frustrate your actions. There is scope for delaying such information. Or it concerns an ongoing legal proceeding. I think this is fairly clear. So in terms of implementation, again, the board secretariat will have a lot more work. You have to publish before the board meeting the board's agenda. Again, some regulators do this, some regulators don't. You have to prepare detailed notes and briefing documents for the board because regulation making is going to become that much more intensive. There have to be draft resolutions for every board meeting. Some regulators in other countries actually put out the draft resolutions along with the agenda. And there has to be a better recording of discussions, of decisions, of votes, because all of them will have to be released publicly as the minutes of the meeting. And this is something which we are proposing as a result of what we've seen of some of the functioning of the boards, which is that boards often wait till the next meeting to confirm the minutes of the last meeting. We don't think that's necessary because you can immediately send the minutes of the meeting to every board member after the meeting, and these can be confirmed fairly quickly. You don't actually need and we looked at existing laws, you don't need the board to reconvene to confirm the minutes of the last meeting. And in the present circumstances, when boards meet every 2 months or every 3 months, there's a 12-week lag between the discussion that took place and the minutes that were released. In many cases, regulatory action or enforcement action has already happened before the minutes have been released. So in such cases, the requirement of transparency is completely frustrated. So we are proposing that you start a process where minutes can be immediately circulated, where the board members actually remember what they discussed, where they are in a better position to confirm what they said and what they did not, and release the minutes in 3 weeks. So again, what kind of information should not be released or released after a delay? There are very specific provisions given in the IFC. We've talked about some of them before. And if you're going to go back and think about what types of information should be kept confidential, we would suggest that you look at those and incorporate some of those provisions and write them out in greater detail. One requirement is that for every bit of information that has to be redacted or kept confidential, the board has to vote specifically on every such bit of information. So there is no plenary power to say, yes, we will keep this topic redacted from the public domain. If there are 3 points on the agenda which the board feels should be kept confidential, the board has to take a separate vote on all 3 points. So now I'll just walk you through some of the examples. I would request you to open up page 69 of the handbook. I'm sorry, can you go to 72? This is figure 6.3. So this is about how you can enhance the readability of regulations on your website. So 6.3 is also up on the screen right now. The interesting part here is this is the FCA handbook. You can actually go to a specific date and see the regulations as they existed on that date. So what a lot of regulators do currently is to say Regulation 10 of 2004 as amended on June 2005, then January 2006, then September 2007, stands amended today, and clause A is deleted and clause B reads so and so. This enables you to cut through all of that. You can go to 4th May 2012 and look at the regulation and as it existed then. And this actually says you are now viewing a past version of the handbook. And this is of great benefit when you're trying to understand what regulation existed on what date. If a regulated entity did something 3 years ago and is not sure of what the applicable laws were then, there is huge benefit to understanding what is happening on a specific date. It's also easier for you at the back end to see. So one thing some regulators have done is to get the front end on their website be mirrored on the back end. So you see more or less what the public is seeing with additional add-ons. You can make changes, you can hide particular bits of information. You can use that platform to transmit messages or emails to your colleagues and superiors. But it's more or less a mirror image of what is available to the public. So you might actually be seeing the same page. Someone sitting in the FCA might be seeing the same page as someone who is accessing the FCA website to see what regulations are applicable to him or her. So that's one way of how regulators have started thinking much more about online platforms, because they are seeing the same thing that the public is seeing, or more or less the same thing that the public is seeing. The readability has to be consistent. The regulator is forced that much harder to think about readability and accessibility.
Any person may understand readability differently.
Right.
We at SEBI may be able to understand the way we've updated it on the website better than somebody else from the public, or let's say from RBI. So either you have to have a common plan for all the regulators, or at least a step-by-step process that is to be adopted for each website. Otherwise, invariably, the readability on each regulator's website will differ.
Right.
And there may be complaints in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of how far regulators want to do this on a common platform or on a common minimum standard basis. If there's consensus that you need to do it and you want to do it, we'll be more than happy to help. But
that is some time, sir. That will take some time.
Yeah. I'll just move on to another small example. This is about how amendments to regulations or statutory instruments are shown. So this is something, this is an amendment to a particular notification by the Prudential Regulation Authority in the UK. And they first say in this annex, Underlining indicates new text and striking through indicates deleted text. And then all the changes in the regulation are written like that. All the underlined text is the new text and all the deletions are made inline.
Yes, so very, you can understand it right away.
So you don't need to open 3 different documents, compare them and see what's happening. It's all inline. It's a very small change, but it can be done at all. Yeah, yeah. Right.
No, this is just the
No, no, this is the last version.
This is just the last version. You
Yeah.
won't go 3 times before. You will just show the last version.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Right.
Every word, every format is going to kill innovation and creativity.
No, so we are not saying that you have to adopt exactly this. I'm just saying there are better ways of doing what we are currently doing. We still put out all this information. It's just about enhancing readability and accessibility. I think if you go to any of the websites and download all the data, I think the same volume of information is available. Another interesting thing FCA has done is to put a user guide for their handbook. Now this basically enables the dumbest person on the planet to go and become an expert on the FCA website. So they give you everything from whether they are up, how do you know whether they are up to date? Can I see how they will look at a particular date? So everything that is going on in the website is explained in a user guide. It's something regulators can think about. The next thing is we talked about how meetings of the agencies in other regulatory agencies are transparent. So SEC puts up an agenda. This is actually put up on 12th March or modified on 12th March for the meeting. And this is a very brief agenda of what they're doing. But they're required to put it up a week before the meeting. Again, I said I would give you an example of how the minutes are recorded. So this is the Financial Stability Oversight Council in the US. It gives the date, it gives a list of who was present, including any guests or guests brought by members of the agency. It gives you a list of who all made presentations during the meeting. And then it gives you a very detailed discussion, detailed transcript of what is going on during the meeting. So for example, the Deputy Secretary introduced the first agenda item regarding the current draft of the annual report. It says who disagreed, who said what, the members of the council asked questions and had a discussion. And if you look at the FCM minutes, some of them are even more detailed. At the end of the minutes, they put up the resolution that was voted on by the board. And they said that the council approved the resolution by a unanimous vote. So they're putting out all of this information more as a transcript of what happened rather than a summary of the discussion. And it can help in a variety of other situations also. Suppose an investigating agency is asking you why you gave a certain approval or why you decided to take an enforcement action against a particular entity. You put up the entire deliberation, it's self-explanatory. If you put up a gist of the discussion, they are going to ask you more questions. So it also helps the regulator stay on the right side and stay away from trouble. So that's another value add that this brings.